So here we have the cerebellum, and it's part of the brain that lies underneath the occipital lobe in the back of the head, and it includes has the role of coordination of movement and the maintenance of balance and posture. And the cerebellum works subconsciously, so we're not aware of its functioning. It's composed of the two hemispheres. Which are bridged in the midline by the vermis. We have the vermis there. The hemispheres extend laterally, which is sideways, and posterally, so that's why I tried to make it at least semi 3D. The surface of the cerebellum has very distinctive appearance. In the contrast, it has large folds in contrast to the large folds of the cerebral hemisphere, the surface of the cerebellum has fine folds called folia. And so, let's see, there we go. Okay. And let's see, we have the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Okay. And we have the pons, which is part of the brainstem, and it links the medulla oblongata and the thalamus. And here I've sort of represented the medulla oblongata, which is anterior to the cerebellum and the central canal of the spinal cord. Okay, and then we have a different view, inferior view, and again the cerebellum hemispheres. In this view, I've represented the peduncle. So we have the superior cerebellar peduncle, little feet, inferior peduncle, and the middle peduncle. And again, the pons, which is in, we've got the midbrain, and then the pons, and the pons, which runs down to the medulla oblongata or connected to the medulla oblongata. And that is the cerebellum and the pons. Here we have the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia has a number of components which are all anatomically and functionally closely related to each other. The putamen, together with the caudate nucleus, receive input from the cortex. So we have the caudate nucleus here. Okay. And then I tried to do a multi-dimensional view of the putamen, along with the globus pallidus, which is here. The globus pallidus relays information from the putamen to the midbrain, also known as the substantia nigra. So within the basal ganglia, we've got the lentiform nucleus made up of the putamen and the globus pallidus, all here. Okay, running to the head of the caudate nucleus, we've got the thalamus, and the tail of the caudate nucleus, which runs into the amygdala. Again, giving some perspective, I put hold the camera too. The pons in the brainstem. That is the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is also known as the basal nuclei, which according to the um, atlas that I'm using is a more appropriate name for it. And it controls movement, the beginning or the initiation and termination of movement. And so disorders including Parkinson's, Huntington's chorea, and Wilson's disease are related to damage to the basal ganglia, or the basal nuclei, the group of nerves making up the basal ganglia. Here's a clay representation of the limbic system. The limbic system is a ring of interconnected structures that lies deep within the brain, and it makes connections with other parts of the brain and associated with mood and memory. The human brain is considered to be made up of 3 parts, having to evolve one after the other. We have the brain stem, which is the oldest part of the brain and seen as the sort of life support system. And we have the cerebral cortex, which is the final part of the human brain, and it's related to thinking and reasoning. And between the evolution of the two, we have the limbic system, which allows the development of feelings and emotions in response to sensory information. It's also associated with a behavior such as closeness to offsprings and maternal bonding. The limbic system is made up of the amygdala, which is an almond-shaped nucleus and appears to be linked to feelings of fear and aggression. The hippocampus, which is a structure that seems to play a part in learning and memory. The cingulate gyrus, and that connects the limbic system to the cerebral cortex, the part of the brain that carries conscious thoughts. Extensive connections between the limbic system and the cerebral cortex allows human beings to use their knowledge of the outside world to regulate their response to emotions. The cerebral cortex can thus override more primitive limbic systems when necessary. As I stated, the limbic system lies between the cortex and the brainstem and makes connections with both. It's through these connections that the limbic system provides a way in which individual emotional states can influence the internal state of the body. This prepares the body perhaps for an act of self-preservation, such as running away in fear or for sexual encounters. The limbic system. Also within the limbic system is the hypothalamus. And this regulates the body's internal environment, including blood pressure, heart rate, and hormone levels. The limbic system generates its effect on the body by sending messages to the hypothalamus. So not only does the limbic system allow emotions to influence the body, but also enables emotional responses to be regulated. The limbic system. So here's my clay model of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. The thalamus. It's a major sensory relay and integrating sensor in the brain. It lies deep within the central core, and it's consisting of two halves that receive sensory input from all types except for smell. Okay, here I've represented the two halves in more detail on the right side here. Alrighty, so let's see, camera focus. Alright. The thalamus is made up of paired egg-shaped masses of gray matter. Like I said, deep within the central core of the diencephalon, or the between brain. It lies on either side of the fluid-filled third ventricle, and it's connected to each other by a bridge of gray matter, the interthalamic adhesion. The front end of the thalamus is rounded and narrower than the back, which is expanded into the pulvinar. And here we have the pulvinar, and then we have the narrower front or anterior. Okay, the upper surface of the thalamus is covered with a thin layer of white matter, the stratum zonale, a second layer of white matter, the external medullary lamina, that's what it is representing there. Okay. These thalamic nuclear groups are separated by ventricle Y-shaped sheets of white matter. And the anterior nucleus lies in the fork of the Y. The tail divides the medial and the lateral nuclei and splits to enclose the intralaminar nuclei. All right, so there we have the internal medullary lamina, okay, which helps to control alertness. And then the dorsal medial nucleus, which integrates information about mood and instinct. The lateral posterior nucleus, which is involved in the integration of sensory information. The pulvinar, which integrates somatic sensations and auditory and visual information. Okay. The lateral posterior nucleus, that's involved in integration of sensory information. The lateral geniculate body relays visual information to the occipital lobe of the cerebral cortex. The ventrolateral, and that's the yellow mound there, nucleus. And that's involved in the control of voluntary movement. And then the ventral anterior nucleus, which is involved in the control of voluntary movement as well. The thalamus is composed of a number of distinct nuclei. Each of these nuclei receives sensory input from the different sources, and as I stated, it is specific to the region of the brain. So that is the thalamus. Below the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is, again, a complex structure located in the deep core of the brain, and it regulates fundamental aspects of the body and is critical for homeostasis and maintenance of equilibrium in the body's internal environment. The hypothalamus is a small region, again, in the diencephalon. It's about the size of a thumbnail, weighs only about 4 grams, lies below the thalamus, and separated from it by a shallow groove, the hypothalamic sulcus. All right. The hypothalamus is just behind the optic chiasm, the point where the two optic nerves cross over as they travel from the eyes toward the visual area of the back of the brain. Okay. The hypothalamus, just as a source of location, I've put the corpus callosum there at the top, and then there's space there to indicate the ventricle. All right. So here we have the paraventricular nucleus, and it synthesizes hormone oxytocin in females, which causes milk production in the mammary glands and contractions of the uterine walls during childbirth. Okay. And we have the dorsal medial and the ventral medial nucleus, which is concerned with the control of hunger and thirst. Okay. We have the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is concerned with controlling the sleep and wake cycle. And then below the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is the hormones released from the gland are under the distinct control of the hypothalamus. And the dark lines here represent the veins and the going in and out of the pituitary gland from the hypothalamus. Okay. So within the within the hypothalamus, we also have the supraoptic nucleus, which produces vasopressin, which is an antidiuretic or antidiuretic hormone, which increases water reabsorption in the kidneys. Okay. So then the pituitary gland we have the anterior pituitary, and the release of AP hormones is modulated by the sensory or stimulatory factors released by the hypothalamus. And we have the posterior pituitary, the PP. Hormones produced in the supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei in the hypothalamus are secreted into the blood vessels here. And then in the middle, we have the median eminence. And several hypothalamic regulatory hormones are released into small blood vessels in the region of the median eminence. Okay. The hypothalamus regulates a wide range of basic processes, including the pituitary gland, the autonomic nervous system, where nerve fibers travel from the hypothalamus to the autonomic control center in the brainstem. And this influences heart rate, blood pressure, contractions of the gut and bladder, sweat and saliva. Also eating and drinking behavior. Stimulation of the lateral hypothalamus increases hunger and thirst. In contrast, activation of the ventral medial hypothalamus reduces hunger and food intake. Body temperature. Certain areas of the hypothalamus monitor the temperature of the body and act as a thermostat. Control of emotional behavior. The hypothalamus is involved, along with other brain regions, in the expression of fear and aggression, as well as in the control of sexual behaviors. And control of sleep cycles. The suprachiasmatic nucleus contributes to the daily pattern of sleeping and waking, as well as memory. Damage to the mammillary glands associated with impairments of the ability to learn or retain new information. So that is the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. And that concludes my clay models of the brain, where we started with the medial view and then a lateral view of the left hemisphere. It dried up on me. Then we had the inferior view of the brain and the superior view of the brain. And then added the cerebellum, the pons, the basal ganglia, and the limbic system. And last and definitely not least, the thalamus and the hypothalamus.